Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third session in the AARP and Social Innovation Summit virtual series, Longevity Plus, Understanding Evolving Lifespans in a Rapidly Changing World. For those of you who I may not have had the pleasure of meeting before, my name is Olivia Allan, and I am the Executive Vice President and Head of Events at Landmark Ventures, which hosts the Social Innovation Summit, or as we fondly refer to it as SIS. For those of you who may not be familiar with SIS yet, we are a team, platform, and collective community with over 16 years of experience in designing ways to elevate groundbreaking ideas and innovative leaders who are changing the world for better. I'm so honored to welcome you back to this series that we are hosting proudly alongside our friends at AARP. Focusing today on the topic of longevity, resilience, and extreme weather. Before we dive in, just a few housekeeping items. If you'd like to turn on closed captioning, simply navigate to the bottom of your Zoom window and select Show Captions. Additionally, our moderator today will be accepting questions from the audience and during our final panel discussions to pose to our speakers as time allows. So you're welcome to submit your questions through the Zoom Q&A function. And with that, I am so pleased to welcome to the stage a longtime partner and friend of SIS, Staci Alexander, who is the Vice President of Thought Leadership for AARP, to introduce today's session. Welcome, Staci.
Hello, everyone. As Olivia said, my name is Staci Alexander, and I am Vice President of Thought Leadership at AARP. As many of you know, AARP is an organization dedicated to empowering people everywhere to live their best lives as they age. Our team at AARP works to elevate groundbreaking ideas, convene innovative thought leaders, and advance work to change paradigms and surface new solutions so that everyone can live healthy and engaged lives. Together with our partners at Landmark Ventures, we are taking a deeper look at the evolution and implications of longevity. The first session in the Longevity Plus series focused on the idea of longevity interrupted. We had an exceptional group of thought leaders join us in discussing how life expectancy in the United States has faltered as of late and what it means for our collective futures. Our second session centered the idea of longevity extended and how, despite setbacks in life expectancy, recent advances across health, science, and technology have set out to create unprecedented gains in lifespans and health spans. If you missed the previous session, you can watch a replay by clicking on the link in the chat. As we continue to navigate the cutting-edge frontiers of longevity, we are thrilled to have such a robust group of speakers join us to explore these questions and more. With that, I am pleased to introduce my AARP colleague, Dr. Jodi Miller, Director of Thought Leadership for Financial Resilience, who will moderate our exciting conversations today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Staci and Olivia. My name is Jodi Miller, and I am Director of Thought Leadership for Financial Resilience at AARP. We are so excited to have an amazing conversation today. As you've heard, we have an incredible lineup of speakers as we explore the intersection of longevity, equity, and resilience in the face of disasters and extreme weather. So let's get started. I am so honored to be joined first by Dr. J. Marshall Shepard, a leading international expert in weather and climate and the Georgia Athletic Association Distinguished Professor of Geography and Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Georgia. In addition to his many academic accolades, Dr. Shepard is the host of the Weather Channel's award-winning Sunday talk show, Weather Geeks, and routinely appears on CBS, Face the Nation, Nova, The Today Show, CNN, Fox News, The Weather Channel, and more. Dr. Shepard, thank you so much for joining us today. As a meteorologist, weather has long been a central topic on your mind. How about for the rest of us over time? How have you seen the general public's relationship with extreme weather and disasters change over time?
Well, first, thank you for having me. I'm actually just en route from Atlanta back to Athens, Georgia, because I spoke in Atlanta on some of these very topics. Clearly, weather is something that affects us every day. I'm in a unique position as an atmospheric scientist and meteorologist in that my science is one that people perceive that they understand quite well because they experience weather and climate And so it's a kind of can be quite interesting having these conversations, a little bit different. People often, come up to me with their thoughts and theories on weather and climate. I doubt a nuclear engineer gets the same conversations because people just perceive they know the weather. But we know that our weather is changing. We're seeing clear evidence in the scientific studies that the world that I live in. But if you're just paying attention and thinking about the weather that you experienced perhaps when you were a child versus now, there's clearly something different, and we know what it is. And so what we're trying to understand now from a scholarly perspective is how increased intensity and frequency of heat waves, how more extreme rain events, how more intense hurricanes and wildfires are impacting people, infrastructure, and their vulnerabilities. And it's really important to talk to AARP. I'm a really good close friend and actually a fraternity brother of Sean Akias, who used to be with AARP. And we've had these conversations because uh, the senior populations are one of the four vulnerable groups as we see these changes.
With that said, what comes to mind for me, or part of what comes to mind for me in today's conversation, is the role of technology. I would love to hear, what are some of the most promising recent technological and scientific advances that you anticipate will help more people and communities anticipate and build resilience in the face of extreme weather and disasters?
Sure. So, yeah, we know that risk is a function of the natural hazard itself, exposure to that hazard, sensitivity to it, and resiliency, our ability to sort of adapt or bounce back from those events. So on the one hand, weather forecasting is as good as it's ever been. People have this misconception that, oh, that forecast was bad, when it actually is usually pretty good. The challenge we have is that most people only remember the occasional bad forecast and not the 98% of forecasts that were good. Because when it's a good forecast, it doesn't impact you because it was what you expected. But the one rain event that rained out your event is more prevalent in our minds. But with the advances in computer modeling, weather satellites, advanced radar, even the sort of emergence of artificial intelligence and machine learning, this is a lot. We go through a lot of data in meteorology coming from satellites and models and so forth. And so AI is going to help us parse through that because we know how to make forecasts and we know the things that are needed to make them better and to improve upon them. But just such a large data volume at times has been a challenge for us. So really excited about the advent of artificial intelligence and machine learning. I know some people are scared off by it, but it's just a really important way of handling and parsing through large volumes of data.
Wow, that's really exciting to think about. Thank you for sharing that. You have pioneered work at the intersection of social inequalities and impacts of extreme weather events and disasters. Your TEDx talk about the weather gap comes to mind as one example. Can you talk about the weather gap and how human longevity factors into the equation?
Sure. So this extreme weather climate gap that I often talk about is this notion that everyone may be exposed to a heat wave or a hurricane or a tornado or a wildfire or a flood, but there are certain parts of our society that are more vulnerable to that exposure and have more or less resiliency to bounce back from that exposure. So I'll give you an example with Hurricane Katrina from 2005 in New Orleans. Everyone in the Gulf region was exposed to the hurricane. But if you looked at the faces that were sort of there at the Superdome needing shelter and food and transportation and medical care, it was a vulnerable community ranging from communities of color to some of the poor communities in that region. Many senior elderly population over 65 were also in that group of vulnerable populations. And so as we are living longer and have access to better health care and so forth, we have to be aware of the fact that there are parts of our community, particularly above a certain age, that live in homes that may not be adequately air conditioned, or may live in 100 or 500-year flood zones and so forth. And we know these events are increasing in frequency or intensity. And so we need to have strategies working perhaps in partnership with these organizations today and others to understand these vulnerabilities. In fact, one of the things that worries me when I hear about 118-degree temperatures in Phoenix, Arizona, is not the 118-degree temperatures, actually. It's the fact that at night, at midnight, it was still 90 degrees. That's when we start to have medical or health disparities and so forth. And so this is one of the things that, I try to convey when I speak to a group such as yours.
With that said, a follow-up question for you is what do you see as some of those opportunities or solutions or strategies, as you mentioned, to minimize the weather gap and to create extreme weather and disaster resilient strategies that can really prioritize health and wealth and improve outcomes for populations that have historically faced discrimination?
Well, I mean, I used to work at NASA. I was there for 12 years as a scientist, but it's honestly not rocket scientist or science. It's really about the economic gaps. Resiliency is very much tied to the economic capabilities. If I'm living in New Orleans and there's a Cat 5 hurricane approaching, I can pack up my family and go inland to Memphis and stay in a hotel for 5 days. No problem. I have that type of economic resiliency. I know when I get back, I've got decent insurance on my home. Those are the drivers of the gap that I talk about. And so we really have to close the economic and income gap at all ages in order to close the extreme weather climate gap. On the weather climate side of the house, I mean, and again, I don't know if there's a reason why you all are framing in terms of extreme weather, but I'm comfortable calling it climate change. But we know that climate is changing and that there is clearly a solution space that involves reducing fossil fuels and mitigating carbon emissions, because that's the only thing that's going to get that sort of genie back in the box. And then the third thing is I think organizations like yours are enabling and empowering, and that's important. There's a messaging around the things that need to be done about increasing resiliency to heat, floods, and so forth. I can't do that from a scientific perch. We need partnerships with organizations, NGOs, and so forth. And so that's why I was really tried to make it as possible to be a part of this, because these are the connective sort of bridges that we need in order to enable solution spaces. So Julie, I want to thank you and your organization for this opportunity.
Dr. Marshall Shepard, thank you so much for joining us. Your work and your comments are powerful. We really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
We're going to transition now to our second speaker in today's event and start to drill down even more into aging and longevity and how it relates to our topic today. I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Alexis Merdjanoff, Clinical Assistant Professor in Social and Behavioral Sciences at New York University's School of Global Public Health and Director of Research for the Population Impact, Recovery, and Research Program. She is a public health sociologist who explores how population health is affected by exposure to natural hazards, including hurricanes, floods, extreme heat, and fires. Dr. Merdjanoff, thanks so much for being here today. Let's jump right in. Can you paint a picture for us broadly about impacts of disasters and extreme weather events on the lives of older adults? Physical, financial, emotional, or others, and particularly among older adults and groups who have historically faced discrimination?
Yeah, so generally across all age groups, older adults are the least prepared and they are the most at risk during all phases of a disaster. You can think about the mitigation, the preparedness, the response, and the recovery phases. If we're thinking about the physical impacts, older adults have the highest rate of disaster-related deaths. And we can often attribute this to chronic health conditions that are existing prior to an event happening, disabilities, or even depleted social networks, especially focusing on older adults who might live alone. Disabilities themselves actually place older adults at double the risk of disaster-related injury or death and makes them less likely to evacuate. It also increases their recovery time. Financially, most older adults are living on a fixed income, so they don't really have the resources to face a financial shock like a disaster. There's also this very complex recovery system that older adults have to navigate. There's usually a lot of paperwork. They're dealing with insurance providers or maybe arguing with them. And then they have to make this decision, do I rebuild? Do I relocate? I've also heard countless stories, especially after Hurricane Sandy, of older adults being targeted by scams from contractors. So they're very weary of trying to find assistance to rebuild. Despite all of this, even though they're very vulnerable to the event itself, when it comes to either mental health or emotional health, older adults tend to bounce back pretty quickly and they exhibit pretty high levels of psychological resilience. And this is actually what I find to be the most interesting about older adults and this intersection with disasters is that, you know, they tend to have this perspective that, you know, bad things happen in life sometimes. And this is just another bad thing that's happening, and they've lived through them before. And so they'll get through this too. And so long as they have their health and their family, the material possessions don't matter as much. That doesn't mean they're not stressed, but it does help them kind of put these events in perspective.
That's interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I'm curious, similar to what I asked Marshall Shepard right before this, what approaches would you lift up or highlight for us that can really address some of the impacts of extreme weather and disasters on older adults in particular?
Well, I would say that, you know, we know a lot about older adults when it comes to preparedness, when it comes to evacuation. We don't know as much about older adults when it comes to recovery. And so, you know, we know why older adults are at risk. We know what we can do to, what kind of programs we can implement to kind of decrease this risk. So my work focuses kind of on this back end, right? The long-term recovery, the resilience of older adults. Once all the media coverage dies down, you know, when people start to forget that an event has happened, what do older adults need and to be able to have a healthy life? Do they need financial resources? Do they need assistance finding housing? Do they need help navigating FEMA and insurance claims? We don't really know. So one of the projects I'm actually working on is following a group of 60 older adults who lived through Hurricane Ian in Southwest Florida last September. And we're going to be tracking them over the next 5 years and interviewing them several times to try to understand how this event has impacted their ability to age well, how it's shaped their views about the future, and what they need to recover.
Any hypotheses that you want to share with us at this point?
You know, I think that a lot of it comes down to social support and ties to your community. We have found in the past with our studies on Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Sandy that the older adults who are, you know, tied to senior centers or have family in the neighborhood, that helps facilitate their recovery. I think that older adults who live alone, especially older adults who are renters, that's a huge piece of this, that they are at heightened risk, and that's probably going to be, you know, when all is said and done, those are the populations that we can say, hey, these are the older adults that need the most assistance post-disaster.
Wow. Thank you. And really, this is, I think, a tremendous preview for the next part of our session coming up. So thank you for helping us think through some of the pieces around renting and owning as well. I'm curious, we're really tossing around this word resilient and resilience a fair amount during this session. And I know that a lot of work that you do really focuses on that construct of resilience. So I would love to hear, what do you think it means to be resilient in the face of extreme weather events and disasters? And are there any particular organizations or institutions that you see are really building that resilience?
Yeah, so I think sometimes the word resilience gets a bad rap. And so to me, it's really important to start to distinguish between individual or psychological resilience and community resilience. So being psychologically resilient, it just means, you know, you can bounce back from a stressful event, or you can adapt to it. In the case of older adults exposed to disasters, you're likely to consider yourself recovered. You're not necessarily exhibiting symptoms related to depression or anxiety or PTSD. So, you know, I think that that's interesting that, especially if we think about older adults being psychologically resilient to an event. We've seen that in our past studies. But to me, where we can really start to put our energy is into community resilience. And that's when an impacted area can kind of bounce back quickly. Think about getting the electricity back on, or fixing roads and bridges and tunnels, clearing debris, getting businesses and schools reopened, creating long-term recovery groups. And so I think that we can invest in community resilience because it can actually help facilitate individual or psychological resilience. For older adults, the types of institutions that are really helping facilitate individual resilience are senior centers, religious institutions. These play a really large role in facilitating community resilience for older adults. Senior centers, I've seen a lot in both New Jersey and the Gulf South. They often provide members with reminders to put together their go bag before hurricane season, or make sure you have an evacuation plan. Sometimes they even have phone trees so they can check on other members of the senior center. And then religious institutions, especially post-event, they play a huge role in providing access to food and shelter and resources. And I think the important thing to note about both of those examples is that these are relationships that are built on trust that exists before a disaster occurs. And so that's why it's really important to start to invest in community resilience in these disaster-prone areas before an event happens.
Alexis, you have mentioned several resources, several types of organizations or institutions that can be helpful in the spirit of really forging and cultivating resilience. I'm curious, what would you say collaboration could, should, or does look like in building resilience? And that could be across sectors or across organizations.
Yeah, so if I'm thinking about collaboration, I think that this is where that idea that older adults, it's actually a heterogeneous group. And we tend to do this messaging for older adults. It's like everybody 65 and older, it applies to everybody, right? And yet we know that if you're trying to reach out to adults with disabilities or older adults with who live alone or older adults who rent, like that messaging might need to be different. And so I think that that's where a lot of collaboration can come in, is for us to think about, how can I reach somebody who, there's also a huge difference among older adults, just age-wise, right? Like a 65 to 74, 75 to 84, 85 plus, like there are huge differences there. And so thinking about how can we reach these very diverse groups of older adults with our messaging around emergency preparedness, like that's super low-hanging fruit to try to help people put together an emergency kit, an evacuation plan. I think that there's also at the community level that there are some things that we can do. The city of New Orleans has this great plan where anybody who needs help evacuating, you can sign up and go to one of these 17 designated centers, and they'll pick you up and take you to the NBA arena there and get you out of the city. And so those are things that communities can do to try to identify those who are most vulnerable and help them during a disaster.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Dr. Alexis Merdjanoff, you've given us a ton to think about. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the really important work that you do.
Thank you for having me.
I want to transition now to our final two experts who will help us dive deeper into our topic today and explore what it means for our collective futures. I'm so pleased to welcome Jodi Olshevski, Executive Director and Corporate Gerontologist at the Hartford Center for Mature Market Excellence. Jodi leads a team that is nationally recognized as the preeminent corporate gerontology organization in the United States. I'm also very happy to welcome Dr. Jeremy Porter, Head of Climate Implications Research at First Street Foundation. Jeremy's work focuses on the social and economic implications of risk and/or exposure to climate hazards. Jeremy teaches at City University of New York and Columbia University is an editor of multiple spatial demography publications. Jodi and Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you
for having us.
Thank you both. So Jeremy, I'd like to start with you on this first question. We'll move over to Jodi right after that. We are confronted so often these days, directly and indirectly, with impacts of extreme weather. How is the focus of today's conversation reverberating in different areas of your field?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that sort of combining some of what we've already heard from the other speakers really is important to the work that we do at the First Street Foundation and my own research. Marshall talked early on about the fact that, climate disasters and hazard and exposure to that risk is increasing. And we can see it in the observed records. It's not It's one thing to kind of project out into the future, but it's another thing to actually look at the historic records and say there's more water in the street. The heat waves are longer, or they're more persistent, or they're happening more often. More acres are being burned by wildfire. And when you start to intersect that with where people are living, you start to think about it. Well, how do we build these resilient communities, and how do we build resilient properties for individual homeowners? So really thinking about kind of this changing risk, and the fact that, just 10 years ago, whenever we talked about climate research and the fact that there was climate change that was occurring, we would talk about something that would occur in 2100. And now, like within the last 5 to 10 years, we've kind of pivoted to saying, hey, this is already happening. We have short-term projections. We know what it's going to look like in the next 20, 30, 40 years. So we can start to actually prepare and become more resilient as communities and as residents and property owners.
Thank you. Jodi, would love to hear, how is today's conversation showing up in different parts of your work in your field?
Yeah. I think that I've noticed just an increasing dialogue and focus within the aging world, if we want to call it that, particularly over the last few years. I think people are starting to consider the possibility that extreme weather should be impacting people's housing plans, as well as just a lot of what Alexis covered, which is increased focus on the vulnerability that some older adults have in withstanding the extreme weather. Particularly last year, there were a number of thought leadership articles and other things that came out. The Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University published this great paper, which did kind of an overview of a lot of different issues and raised research questions that I think those of us who are involved in the aging world need to consider. As well as, I know the NIA is part of a broader NIH-wide initiative that funds research. I'm very excited to see that. So I think there's been an acceleration of focus on this. And I was really excited in the public sphere last November to actually see the New York Times publish an article about rethinking where to retire, which really teased out these issues of climate change, and that we think people are starting to think about it, but certainly it needs to happen more.
Wow. Okay. Thank you both. Jeremy, I want to pivot back to you. I'd love to hear, what are some of the most promising recent advances in technology and data science that can ultimately help more people and communities build resilience in the face of extreme weather and disasters?
Yeah, and that's really our focus at the First Street Foundation is, taking this advanced, really sophisticated scientific information that lives in academic journals, or it lives, in the government agencies and the universities that produce it, and trying to make it accessible and digestible so that people can understand what climate science is telling us about today and into the future. But more than that, the advances that we've seen recently are trying to make it tangible in a way that makes that information personal to the individual. So we build a website where individuals can go in, type in their address, and actually understand climate risk, from flood risk, wildfire risk, heat risk, to their personal property. And when it's something that affects your property specific, then all of a sudden, it's not something that feels really abstract and something that's out there that may not impact you. All of a sudden you're saying, wait, I live in a 100-year flood zone. If we were to have a 100-year flood, I would have a foot of water in my building. It may cost me X amount of dollars. And all of a sudden, all of this risk that at one point felt sort of unknown, or at least hard to find, hard to communicate, really becomes easy to understand if it's presented in a way that's personal, that's tangible, and that makes the information accessible. So I think what we're seeing now, I mentioned the website we created, riskfactor.com, but there's a whole slew of these tools that have been developed that help people understand risk. And really, when you're planning for the short term, you're talking about the next 10, 20 years or so, understanding what that risk looks like in the very near future and starting to incorporate that risk into things like housing decisions, which were a point that was just made, is really important. When we started doing this research in 2018, we talked to some realtors in Miami, and they said people are asking us the number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, and what's the elevation of the property. So elevation became an amenity on the housing market because of tidal flooding and flooding in the area. So I think that's really slowly starting to make its way into some of the major decision processes that we're making today.
Wow, thank you so much. I'm thinking about research and the power of research and data. Jodi, I know that a lot of your center's work incorporates research and action. What do we know about how families engage in conversations about disaster preparedness?
Yeah, we did some research with the MIT Age Lab. It seems like ages ago now. It was in '07 and '08, just on, after Hurricane Katrina. And in a quantitative survey that we did, we found that most people said that if something were to happen, they would rely on family members, friends, and neighbors to help them to prepare and recover, right? Which makes logical sense. About 94% said that, but only a quarter of those people had actually had those conversations. So I think these are conversations that we all need to have. They're what I call kind of part of the difficult conversations that we don't want to or don't like to have, but are really critical that we do have. In the qualitative side of that research, we talked to people who had experienced different types of disasters. And we heard, again, not surprisingly, that those people who had planned ahead of time, spoken to family and friends before the disaster actually struck, had a lot of peace of mind that came from being prepared. They felt less stressed in the aftermath because they knew who they could count on for support. And they felt more in control of their physical and emotional recovery. So when Alexis was talking about resilience, I thought, well, it's kind of interesting to know the connection. Perhaps this research suggested that connection. The other piece is that we ended up doing a second study with family caregivers of people with dementia, because in that first phase, the people who were caregivers couldn't even go there and think about preparation, because they were so, of course, they had their hands full with the day-to-day requirements that occur when you're caring for a person with dementia, as well as trying to plan for their future care needs. And of course, planning and conversations for them, I would say, if it can even be more critical, is even more critical. So again, conversations are really important. Many of us don't do it. Out of that research, to get to your question around action, we try to always translate our research into tangible outcomes to help people have these conversations. So we put together 2 guidebooks that can be downloaded from our website, which is thehartford.com/CMME. You'll be able to find your way there. The first one is called "It Could Happen to Me: Family Conversations About Disaster Planning." The second one is "The Calm Before the Storm: Family Conversations About Disaster Planning, Caregiving, Alzheimer's Disease, and Dementia." So we're hoping that these tools will help people have the conversation if they haven't already started to do that.
Great. Jodi, thank you so much for sharing that. You've brought up multiple really important topics, including things like caregiving, of course, including things like housing. And a question that comes to mind for me is how you see impacts of extreme weather and disasters shaping the ways in which people of all ages, including older adults, need to be preparing differently for long lives. I'd love to hear just a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to think differently, right? We have to consider the possibility, and maybe I've started saying the likelihood about that a disaster and extreme weather could happen to us, to each of us. This concept of aging in place, which we talk a lot about, typically involves thinking about where we live, how we want to live, how to ensure we receive services. We've been thinking about how do we expand that first, and we did a project a few years ago around the physical structure of a person's home, because we know that if people aren't able to maintain their home, just generally speaking, chances are they're not going to be able to stay there. And now I think we need to add in the possibility or likelihood of extreme weather. What does that mean? We should all be thinking about that as we think about the future, the financial implications, the reality of the location, how a person's health might affect that, and then that extra layer of complexity around caregiving. And even if we're not a caregiver, chances are we will be at some point. And so I think it's just we need to expand our thinking in terms of planning.
Right. Jeremy, how about you? Any thoughts that you want to add about how we can and need to be thinking differently, perhaps about longevity as it relates to extreme weather and disasters?
Yeah, I mean, just the fact that we're already seeing impacts from increased disaster exposure, and really the fact that there's this intersection between where individuals live. The property is one thing, damage to your property, aging in place is one thing, but also your community. I mean, the transportation to resources, accessibility to hospitals and medical care. The fact that some places, if we do start to see trends moving into the future and populations start to shift, people are moving towards more climate resilient communities. who moves and who stays. We also know in the demographic research that older individuals tend not to move as much as younger individuals. So what does that mean for your community moving into the future? What types of opportunities are going to be there? What are the economic circumstances around the labor force that remains in those communities? So it ends up being really, really important for your own assets, for your nest egg, the property that you've put most of your money into, but also what's the community going to look like? Is it going to be a place in 10, 15 years that can still support the lifestyle that you want to live? I think all of those things are really, really interconnected, and oftentimes we'll see outcomes at kind of the personal level that are driven by community kind of structural conditions that aren't necessarily immediately clear when you just think about direct climate exposure to one's property or something like that.
Thank you for really challenging us to think forward as much as possible about both the direct and indirect possibilities, right? When we have our conversation today. Thank you. So I'm really interested. There are a few constructs, big constructs that have come up in our conversation today. Things like control, trust, risk. Risk is another one, and that's really a fascinating construct, and one in which you both are quite familiar with the work that you do. So I'd love to stick with Jeremy on this one, then we'll pivot to Jodi. Jeremy, what do we know about risk and how it plays into today's conversation in a number of different ways?
Yeah, I think you're right. The risk is such a broad topic, and it means a lot of different things to different people. I think in our world, we're really focused on physical risk and exposure to climate change. I think that in and of itself, there's two different definitions right there. I mean, exposure is a component of risk, but then there's also vulnerability to that exposure, which is another dimension or component of risk. So the exposure, for instance, a property may be exposed to flooding. It may be in a flood zone, but if that property is raised 3 feet above its 1 in 100 year flood inundation level, it's actually not vulnerable to the risk that exists in that area. So whenever we think about risk, we try to take a multidimensional approach and understand that there's a lot of different ways to look at it. People want to live in coastal areas. There's a ton of risk in coastal areas. If you can build to a level that allows you to be resilient in that community, then so be it. You're able to continue to live in communities that you want to live in. You're protecting yourself against the exposure in the area, and you become less vulnerable in regard to your own personal property. There's another question about how communities manage the risk and manage the exposure and the vulnerability of their own. Again, network of resources in the community and the amenities that serve the people in that community. But we really always think about it from that physical perspective, and the exposure to potential climate risk. Flooding is the one that pops up easily. We can all recognize that, but wildfire risk, if you live out west, heat risk is a growing concern across the country. Wind risk from tropical cyclones throughout the Gulf Coast. So just understanding that risk and understanding your exposure to that risk is really important to move beyond just that base level of I have risk or I don't have risk.
Yeah. Are there any resources, Jeremy, that you would want to lift up that can help homeowners, buyers, and renters understand and address risks related to extreme disasters?
Yeah, I mean, we always, prop up our website, riskfactor.com. We compile a lot of that information, but the reason why I'll mention it here as a tool for this is because we're taking all of this different disparate information, compiling it in one place and trying to make it available in an accessible and digestible way. The federal government also has a lot of really, really good resources for this. For instance, FEMA has a ton of really, really good information on resilience, flood risk, resources for the transfer mechanism of that risk through insurance policies and things like that. So there's a lot of really, really good information that exists there. But I think starting, at your personal property, understanding your own risk, and then kind of moving out from there is probably the best way to do that. And that's really what we built our tools around, and kind of what we focus on.
Great. Thank you so much. I'd love to shift to Jodi to understand how the topic of risk comes up in today's conversation from your perspective.
Yeah. I had to write down that website, Jeremy, because I'm interested in checking it out. So yeah, I mean, in the research that we did, we focused a little bit on this idea of risk perception among older adults and preparation, and people, generally speaking, that we talked to don't think it's going to happen to them. That's why we named our guidebook kind of a version of that. In disaster-prone areas, preparation sometimes can become part of the background. People underestimate the amount of time to prepare and the chaos that occurs pre-event. I experienced that a few weeks ago. I'm in Southern California. We had that hurricane that just never happens. And I mean, there was a greater fury than a snowstorm in the Northeast. And, we don't plan for that. Near misses can sometimes influence people to not take future threats seriously, be less concerned, and then be less prepared. And it's really important that we have to remember that past experiences with extreme weather may not predict, might not be a reliable guide for future risks. So it's critical not to be lulled into a false sense of security. It's really a balance, right, that we each need to work on, and we need to help others around us, particularly older adults, work on. Again, just because the preparation factor is so critical, given its relationship to stress and all the other pieces that we've been talking about.
Yeah, thank you so much. Similar question as I asked Jeremy, are there any additional resources that you would want to share with the group today? Things that can be done to help homeowners, buyers, and renters understand and address risks?
Yeah, I mean, I think the two guidebooks that we put together, or the resources that we try to put in front of people, I think it is also important that people do have adequate homeowner insurance protection. I know this is a very complex situation, but in our guidebook, we've tried to simplify it as much as possible, and we have one page for questions. This is particularly for homeowners, but renters also, it's important to make sure they have the coverage that they need, but questions to ask their insurance professionals to ensure whether they have what they need. So I think that's the other resource that is complicated, but still, again, we try to simplify it to help people have what they need to know.
How can we better help aging adults weigh decisions about where to retire? So, for example, should we focus on where they have community or finding places that will be safer from climate disasters? For example, not on the Gulf Coast. And Jodi and Jeremy, I'll let either one of you jump in on that.
I mean, this is a very important question, a difficult one. I think it does have to be on an individual level. We know social support is so critical in terms of how people age, so it has to be a balance for that particular person. And to me, the most critical piece is to at least be aware if for them, their social support or everything else takes them to a place that might have increased risk, that they know that and they prepare for that. I think that's most important. Jeremy, I'd be interested to see what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean that I think is super important, and I think what we're seeing in recent demographic trends around kind of short term or short distance migration is that 80 to 90% of all moves across the nation happen to be within counties, so they tend to be within metro markets or within housing markets. But we are starting to see that people want to stay close to family. They want to stay close to familiar areas. They want to stay close to the support systems, as you mentioned. But they're also starting to choose, as long as the information is available, more climate resilient areas of those communities. I think the first thing that I remember coming out was in 2017, and there was an article around climate gentrification. You actually saw that Little Haiti neighborhood in Miami was growing faster than Miami Beach for the first time in the history of the neighborhood. And it was because people were aware of the fact that there were these different communities that had a reputation for being areas that would flood or that were particularly vulnerable to climate, and people were actively moving and choosing how to sort themselves within a relatively high risk area overall, but they were finding the lower risk areas in relative form to kind of the rest of the housing market. So I think that staying close to that support network, but then being smart within that context is probably a good way to go about this, and something we've started to see emerge in the migration patterns.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sorry I dropped off for just a minute. We have another question from the chat, any list of better places to retire that have lower risk of extreme weather events. For instance, we know that some states are less ideal than others in terms of power utilization issues and extreme hot or dry weather. Jeremy, maybe we'll hear from you on that one.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I was kind of getting into that a little bit almost on the last answer, but I think there's certainly areas. Every part of the country has some type of exposure. If you're out west, there's particular vulnerability to wildfire risk. On the Gulf Coast, it tends to be tropical cyclones, storm surge, wind risk. Throughout the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, we see a lot of recent increases in extreme precipitation events. We're not really seeing more rain, but we're seeing more rain all at once. So there are these climate hazards that sort of exist all over the country. One of the folks that I work with, he would tell you that Asheville, North Carolina, is the place where you need to retire if you're moving. I think he's probably the homer, which is why he's saying it. But there is a particularly low risk of most of those climate hazards in that area. We find the Great Lakes region is particularly less risky in regard to heat, which is starting to spread across the entire country. So there are little pockets of the country, but really no matter where you go, there's going to be some type of risk. I think it's really understanding that risk and understanding how to protect yourself against that risk. Or, if it's extreme heat, is that something that you're more comfortable dealing with than maybe flood risk on the Gulf Coast? So kind of weighing and balancing those exposures.
Okay. A question for Jodi I'm seeing in the chat. Are there resources that can be shared to support family caregivers and older adults to prepare for emergencies and or extreme weather? So Jodi, I'm thinking a bit about some of the work that you mentioned around caregivers. Can you just elaborate on that a bit?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I'll just give our website again. It's thehartford.com/CMME. If you go to our publications page, the guidebook is called The Calm Before the Storm: Family Conversations about Disaster Planning, Caregiving, Alzheimer's Disease, and Dementia. And a lot of that information in there, it's everything we know we all need to do, plus how do you do that when you're caregiving? And I think you do need to think about a series of different strategies, like how, depending on where the person is, if the person has physical or cognitive issues, if you have to evacuate, what's your plan? How do you do that? How do you convince them, if they're ambulatory and able to function, to leave? What about the shelters? Are they equipped? Can you do your research ahead of time? Those are just some small examples of things that we tried to address that we heard from caregivers. In that guidebook, it's kind of has that extra layer of do all the prep, and then when you're caregiving, what should you be thinking about?
Yeah. So we've talked a fair amount today about individuals and families. I'm seeing a really interesting question in the chat about organizations and companies. Any thoughts from either of you about how organizations and companies can be adapting to extreme weather? We see, for instance, that many corporations, I'm seeing in the chat, are moving their headquarters to particular states, though they may be in higher risk areas. Can you share a little bit about that? Again, Jeremy, maybe we'll start with you if you don't mind.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, there are a few places that we've seen. Oftentimes the development that occurs in a lot of these cities over the last half century happened in places that was relatively safe when the development occurred. Recently, over that time period, they've become more vulnerable to the climate hazards that exist in their areas. A couple of places popped into my mind, like Spirit Airlines call center moved from Houston, Texas, and they specifically cited flood risk. And then you saw the Roper Hospital System in Charleston, South Carolina moving, which is particularly important because every time that there was a severe flood, they were moving patients from the hospital, on gurneys and and in some cases, in the worst cases, on rowboats over to other parts of the hospital. So not having these services in places that are resilient to the type of climate risks that exist in today's area is really important to the proper functioning of the business. And so if those businesses have to move or they're not resilient, it does end up impacting the larger economics of the community. So kind of if companies are investing in their own resilience, protecting themselves against the risk in an area, they're really investing in the community. and they're able to stay open. People are coming in, to the office. The lunch spots around the corner are staying open to serve the workers that are coming into the communities. It just drives so much more kind of peripheral economic activity if we're investing in our communities, and the commercial businesses are a big part of that in terms of sustaining that kind of vitality in the local communities.
Okay, great. I see a couple more questions in the chat that I'd love to toss out. And Jodi, maybe I'll turn to you on this one. Are older Americans particularly at risk versus the rest of the population, due in large part to where they've self-selected to live, places that may be warmer or coastal, as examples?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I can't really speak intelligently about the geographical locations of the population, if that increases more risk. I do know that at least historically, right, past cohorts have gone towards warmer climates, which sometimes in some instances can be in areas that might have greater risk. I think the other piece of it is just thinking about the vulnerabilities that just we all have as we age. And regardless of where we live, especially now with the extreme weather happening in places where we don't expect, like what are those vulnerabilities, and how do we help to prepare ourselves individually and those around us to kind of withstand that, to figure out how to tap into that resilience that Alexis talked about and is researching, I think is really important.
Beautiful, thank you. And Jeremy, a question for you. What do FEMA's recently announced community disaster resilience zones in each state mean for promoting resilience in those areas and in areas that have not been named resilience zones?
Yeah, the news just came out, I think this week. I was reading it maybe over the weekend or early this week. There's something like 400 or so of these communities that are now resilience zones, which means that the federal government can drive resources to those communities for the purpose of resilience in those communities. Some of the changes that we've seen recently directly impact like cost of home ownership burdens around transfer mechanisms associated with insurance. So the NFIP, for instance, in the last couple of years, just adjusted their pricing algorithm, which hadn't been adjusted since the late 1960s. It was the first major change to that pricing algorithm, and some people's insurance rates jumped by about 500% in some places. I mean, there were these huge jumps, and in places with relatively modestly priced homes, that increase in insurance just really isn't sustainable on their monthly budget and sort of the expectation that these individuals signed on for when they moved into their homes. So the fact that these new resilience zones have been identified, and there are mechanisms now at the government level to drive resources to that communities, means that the communities can adapt to the communities, whether it be we need a seawall, we need levees, we need pumps installed, or there could be economic resources to help offset some of the increasing prices in insurance costs in this case, but also other costs. So I think that the fact that those community resilience zones were identified as a big move in making sure that some of the other changes that have taken place around making insurance actuarially sound don't end up having latent consequences that disproportionately affect some portions of our communities than others. And I think that it was a really big move in regards to giving us that mechanism to provide that support.
Great. Well, in our last few minutes today, I want to toss out one more question to both of you, and that is, what are some of your takeaways, some of your maybe aha moments, moments of surprise, or acknowledgement? Okay, we are in concert with others saying something similar. What would you leave us with for today? Jodi, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if my brain can think quickly here, Julie. I think there's so much that has been said. I think I've learned just in this session from everyone who's spoken, who has kind of gotten my mind thinking of what more can we do, particularly with the issue around social support, the variation that exists with older adults, and within my role in my organization, what else can I do? I think it really, we can't just set this by the wayside. We really need to continue to come together and figure out how to help, because our futures depend on it, us individually as we age, as well as the older population and really everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Jeremy, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, it was a terrific session. I really like the ways in which all the different pieces come together. We really focus on physical climate risk, the development of these risk hazards, projecting them into the future. And sometimes you lose track of some of these other components around. It's important, you know, what does this mean in terms of the information? How does it sort of trickle down to the idea of building resilient communities and building resilience? Or what does it mean in terms of the more interpersonal relationships around social support and the kind of networks that are necessary to manage a lot of this exposure? So it's really nice to get out of your own silo and be able to interact with people that are also touching on super important components of the same topic that you generally just don't deal with. So I appreciate kind of seeing how all those things come together.
Amazing. Well, I want to, again, thank you both and thank all of our speakers for your time today. Thank you to our engaged audience members for your fantastic questions and for making the time to join us. I invite all of you to tune in December for our 4th and final session in the Longevity Plus series, where we will be examining the intersection of longevity, disability, and equity, and what that means for all of us. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.